Well, this week I have with me Alex Neil, who is the constituency MSP for Airdrie and Shot. So thank you for coming to talk to me. The reason I wanted to have a chat to you was to talk about your plans to set up an all-party group on Brexit. You'll have sat in the chamber same afternoons as me, and we've been listening to ministerial statements on Brexit almost every week, I think, since we took the decision. So firstly, I wanted to ask you, why do you think there's a need for a cross-party group on Brexit?
I think fundamentally two reasons, Pauline. First of all, Brexit is by far the biggest thing that's happened, probably since this Parliament was established, and it has huge implications for the future of Scotland, the United Kingdom, Europe and the world. And I think this Parliament has a role to play, irrespective of which side of the argument you're on about Brexit. I think we've all got a major role to play in informing the debate and in looking at what's happening next in terms of triggering Article 50, the negotiations, and what do we want out of the negotiations for Scotland and indeed for the wider Europe. The second reason is the mechanisms that exist in the Parliament. You've got obviously the government, you've got the official opposition, the front benches. You also have a formal parliamentary committee that's made up of about 9 or 11 MSPs. But the rest of us don't have any other way of either informing ourselves, expressing our own opinion, or doing the kind of things that you would want to do as a Parliament and as MSPs in exploring all the issues. A cross-party group, and it is combining people who voted Remain, people who voted for Brexit. It's not taking a side on the argument. But what we've come together to do is to look at what needs to be done, what needs to be debated, what are our views, how can we influence the outcome?
Yeah. Well, as you know, I'm going to join the group when the first meeting happens. And like yourself, I do think it's the most important political issue that we faced. And I think it's important that our Parliament has a big say in it. But what do you specifically think that the all-party group could achieve? What contribution do you think it could make? Well,
let me give you an example. There's a lot of scenario planning going on at the present time. Are we going to stay in the single market? Does Scotland as an independent country or as a devolved country, what options would be open to us? Do we join EFTA? Do we join the European Economic Area? Could we remain in the single market but not in the customs union? Etc, etc, etc. And one of the things I would like us to do is actually to go and talk to EFTA and to the EEA and to countries like Norway and find out their experience and what they think are realistic options both for a devolved Scotland and if we do become independent, what an independent Scotland could do. That's just one example of the kind of thing that's important. Another example is there's been a lot of economic reports produced by OECD, the Treasury, Fraser-Wallander Institute and a whole host of other organisations producing reports before the Brexit vote predicting Armageddon within months of the Brexit vote, which hasn't happened. They all got it wrong about that. Now they're producing reports saying in 14 years' time the GDP of Scotland will be 2% less than it otherwise would have been had we not had Brexit. Now I find that kind of stuff quite frankly, a lot of it being nonsense. And I would rather get to people like Mervyn King, for example, whose comments to date, I think, have been very balanced about the net economic impact of Brexit. Now, to some extent, none of us know because this is unknown, it's uncertain. But I want to listen to the people who have respect, like Mervyn King, and to get under some of the nonsense that's being published in some of these reports.
Yeah. So, obviously you've recently said that you had voted to leave the European Union for your own reasons. And I voted Remain, but it was caveated by some demanding some reforms of Europe.
Yes.
And I've been well aware that ordinary voters have felt quite disillusioned, I think, by the remoteness they feel from Europe. And I think to some extent we paid the price for this. What specifically, though, do you think that Scotland's role could be in all of this? So we get regular reports from the First Minister about discussions she's having with Theresa May. But further to that, what else do you think Scotland's role should be in this?
Well, if you look at the negotiations themselves, this is not like 1975 when the UK just had one government in London and operated as a unified unitary state. We now are very much a four-nation state. We have devolved administrations in Scotland, in Northern Ireland and in Wales, and we have elected mayors in London, which has got its own devolved assembly, and increasingly in other parts of England and the English regions. So one of the things that I'm looking towards, and I think we need to influence this, I think we could take the lead in this, is to get the UK government to recognise that this is now a four-nation state they're leading. Therefore, it's absurd, it's unacceptable that they go away and negotiate on their own internal agenda without even telling the rest of us what it is they're trying to achieve, and go and do that and reach a deal without reference to the other three nations and indeed to the English regions and the people who represent them. A lot of the issues that are going to be under discussion, like agriculture and fisheries being the two classic examples, but there are many others, are devolved issues. So they're talking about matters that are our responsibility in relation to Scotland, and therefore I don't believe that they can do that without us being in the negotiating team at the top table. And even if you look at the reserve matters to Westminster, a lot of what the outcome of that will affect the standard and quality of living of people in Scotland, Wales, Northern Ireland and the English regions. All of that, I think, is reason for us to start to demand an inside track, inside involvement, and not as some passive observer to these negotiations. And that's one of the things I personally would like to achieve. And irrespective of whether you're like me, a nationalist who wants independence, or whether you're a devolutionist, I'm sure people recognise the need for people to be involved. I mean, if you're living in the northern towns in England, or indeed in the Welsh valleys, which voted for Brexit, they voted for Brexit because they already feel alienated, and they feel as distant from London, not to mention Brussels, as we do in Scotland.
Well, I think that's an important, absolutely, I think that's an important point. As you said, irrespective of whether you support independence, or like me, you think there should be greater autonomy for Scotland within the United Kingdom. Do you think the direction that we might be heading in then, or we should be heading in, is to devolve more power to the whole of the UK, including Scotland and the other nations? Absolutely.
If you look at the powers that are coming back from Brussels, they fall into broadly two groups. One are powers like agriculture and fisheries in areas that are already devolved, for example, to Scotland in the case of ag and fish. And fishing is extremely important, and the potential that we can now realise in the coastal communities in Scotland from coming out with the vagaries of the common fisheries policy of the EU. So that group is already covering issues devolved, not just to Scotland. Many of these issues are also devolved to Wales, to Northern Ireland, to London, and some aspects even to the English regions. Then you have the reserve group of matters, but they all often cover issues that are at least partially devolved, such as transport and energy and other matters as well. And also, I don't see any reason, quite frankly, why the employment rights legislative competence of the EU that's being transferred back to the UK, I don't see why the three devolved parliaments shouldn't take on those responsibilities, as Gordon Brown has argued, in their respective countries. Right. That would be a logical thing to do. And similarly within England, I think what people want to see is a scattering of power away from Whitehall and Westminster, because this massive centralisation in London hasn't worked.
Yeah, I agree with that. And one of the reasons that I interviewed Ian Fraser a couple of weeks ago, who wrote the book about the banking crisis called Shredded, is that I believe for some time that the financial crash and the impact on ordinary people throughout Scotland and the United Kingdom has led to the disillusionment, not just of the way we're governed in Britain, but the way we're governed in Europe. So I agree with that. And so perhaps you would also agree that immigration is an area which is reserved, but since Scotland might have particular interests in the recruitment of people with a particular skill, do you, like me, perhaps you don't see any reason why we can't have a bigger say?
Absolutely. If you look at countries like Canada, which is a highly devolved country, you know, it's a confederal system. They have flexibilities in their immigration system internally within Canada itself. And the same is true of other advanced countries. Now, there are some things, as long as you're a unitary state, there are some things that quite clearly have to be done at the unitary state level, including in some aspects of immigration. But I go back to when this Parliament was set up and Jack McConnell launched the Fresh Talent Initiative, and that was designed to keep postgraduate students in Scotland for much longer than otherwise would have been the case. And Scotland benefited from that. Our universities benefited. Our health service benefited. We all benefited from that. And unfortunately, the Tories took away the power of the Scottish Parliament to continue with that initiative. But I think the Fresh Talent Initiative was a very, very good example of where you can have flexibility and variance in the application of immigration and visa policy within a state. It doesn't need to all be done and dusted at the state level.
Mm-hmm. I certainly agree with that. So you plan to have some big speakers come to the Parliament. Hopefully Mervyn King might be the first speaker. I think that would certainly be very interesting. And I think, I agree with you, that's the kind of status of the speakers that we should be inviting, to hear directly what they think the prospects for Scotland within this new situation actually are.
I think personally, and I mean, I'm just one of the co-conveners because we're going to run this thing democratically, obviously. And it's particularly important because there's sensitivity around the subject and people take a different view on whether we should remain or come out. So it's important that we do it in a very inclusive way. That's how we run the cross-party group. But one of the things I'm very keen for us to do is not just look at this through a Scottish prism, that we look at through an international prism as well. And I also think in a European prism, because two things have become conflated with each other. One is Europe and the other was the EU. The EU doesn't equate to Europe. Europe is much bigger. It's a much bigger concept, much bigger continent than the area covered by the EU. And because we voted for Brexit, it does throw up a lot of questions, not just about the future of our own country in relation to the EU, throws up a lot of questions about the future of the EU itself, and it throws up wider questions about Europe. I mean, one of my concerns, and I think we should all be concerned about it, is the rise of the far right in so many European countries. Yeah. And if that continues, then, you know, I would be worried about the future for all of us, because some of the ideas being put forward by some of these xenophobes and racists, and some of them are, you know, almost call themselves fascists in some of these countries, is very, very worrying indeed. So I think this is not just about a narrow debate about Brexit. I think it's a wider debate about where's Europe going.
Yes. Well, the last question, since you've raised the issue of the rise of the far right, do you think that there needs to be more honesty then in the debate around what aggrieved people? Many people we know voted for Brexit because immigration was very uppermost in their mind. And I certainly think that the debate has become a bit polarised between the left and now the far right. Do you think there is some middle ground we need to reach to at least show the general public that politicians at least understand their fears, even if they're not?
Absolutely. I think the political elite, first of all, have to stop talking about people who voted for Brexit as if they're some kind of second-class citizen. Because the fact of life is, a lot of these people who voted for Brexit, if you take some of the towns like in the north of England, like Hartlepool and so on, these people had genuine concerns. They are not, every one of them is not a racist or a xenophobe. They were voting for reasons that had nothing to do with immigration or racism or anything related to that. They were voting about their own future, the fact they'll get no job prospects, the fact that their wages are low, the fact that London seems to be totally out of touch. And I think understanding the underlying reasons why people either voted for Remain, because it's important to understand the Remain vote as well. And one of the aspects I found with the Remain vote is a lot of it's a very soft Remain vote. The number of people who've said to me, I voted Remain, but I did it reluctantly, and I'm under no illusions, and I'm not unhappy at the result. So that tells me, actually, there's a lot of people in the middle who are not emotionally attached to the EU, although they're very European in their attitude, and people at the other end who are not averse
I think that
something
is true.
different.
It's true, but there's no doubt for someone like me who voted Remain, but with some caveats, as you said, I was still clear that we had more benefits being part of the wider European Union than not being. But here we are heading out of Europe now, so we must accept our fate.
And make the best of it.
Agree with that. So when is the first meeting going to be?
The first initial, what they call the initial meeting under the rules, is at 6 o'clock on the 29th of November, the day before St Andrew's Day, in the Scottish Parliament, and every MSP is entitled to come along and participate and to join the group, and we'll elect a convener or conveners, joint conveners, and we'll formally agree the objectives, and then we'll take it from there. We'll discuss an initial work programme of what the putative co-conveners are suggesting, and then take it forward. And the idea is really to inform, to act as a watchdog.
And the members of the public who are interested can join the group, can't
That's
they?
right, absolutely. That's after the initial meeting set up by the MSPs.
Well, I look forward to it, Alex. Thank you very much.
Look forward to having you, Pauline. Thank you.